In this next tutorial, we're going to be learning how to plot our data using earlier versions of Microsoft Excel. For example, either Excel 2000 or Excel 2003. Before we take our data points and put them into a graph, we need to first make sure of these three things. The first thing is to make sure that no data cells have been merged and centered. So what that means is maybe earlier you highlighted two cells to combine them together by selecting the merge and center option. If you leave those cells merged and centered, you're going to have issues later on. So it's important to make sure that they are not merged and centered. The other thing is to make sure that there are no letters that are inside of any of the cells that you plan to be plotting. So for example, if earlier you put in the units for every one of these numbers in your cell, that's going to give you a problem later on. Make sure that there's only numbers in the cells that you plan to be plotting for your graph. And the last thing is to just make sure that before you start selecting a graph to input your data to make sure that no cell has been highlighted that is already on a number. So make sure that, say, none of these cells are already highlighted before you start your graph. Just make sure you click off to the right into a blank cell. If you've made sure of those three things, then you're ready to start making a graph. To get started with plotting your data, take your cursor and up at the top of the toolbar you should see something called a chart wizard. It looks like a little blue, yellow, and red bar graph. If you click on that, the chart wizard opens, and you need to select the XY scatter option. It's already going to have selected for you the XY scatter without the lines, so make sure you leave it on that without any lines, and then click the next box. Now you're given a menu that looks like this. The very first thing you need to do is up top to click the series tab, because you're going to be entering your data into a series. And in order to do that, you need to have a series. So after you've selected that tab, move your cursor down and click the option to add a series. Now you have this menu. This is where you enter in the values for your X and Y data. In other words, for your independent and dependent values. The first thing I want to let you know is where it says here the name, leave this blank. It's just going to make things confusing later on whenever you're trying to give your graph a title. And what you first want to do is just enter in the values for your X and Y data. When you do that, you don't need to click inside of this box. So don't. And the same thing down here for your Y values. If you click inside of the Y value box, you're going to make a mistake because it's going to think that this negative, the equal sign, parentheses, 1 parentheses is going to be part of your data, and it's not. So if you've accidentally clicked inside of one of these boxes, just click out of them. To enter the data for your X values, you're going to move your cursor to the very right to this icon with the red arrow. If you click it, you are now able to select those values that belong on your X-axis. 99% of the time, you'll be using time on your X-axis. Almost for every purpose that you do in physics, time will be the independent variable. So I'm going to put the values for time on my X-axis by left-clicking, dragging down until I've selected all 4 values, release my mouse, and then move the cursor over, and you'll see an icon right here with a little red arrow down. If you click that, it takes those values for time and drops them on your X-axis. We'll do the same thing for our Y values, for our dependent variables. We're going to select the little icon with the red arrow next to Y values, and now we're going to move our cursor over. In this case, our dependent variable is distance, so I will left click the first distance value and I will highlight the others, release the mouse, and again come over to select the icon with the red arrow down, and now you've entered in your X and Y data. This is obviously for what I've selected to do a constant speed trial of distance versus time. You may be doing other graphs that involve, say, accelerated motion, but right now I'm just going to be doing this example for my constant speed trial of distance versus time. So now that I've entered in my values, I can now click the next button. It should bring you to this right here, where you can enter in your chart title. And again, you're going to be using the typical format for a chart title, where you have your Y versus your X axis, or in this case, by clicking in the box, I will have distance versus time. And I'm going to put in my title that it is for my constant speed data, especially if I'm going to be doing other graphs of, say, accelerated motion. I'm going to give my x-axis a title here, and on my x-axis are my values for time, so I will label that x-axis time in seconds, and on my y-axis it's distance, so I'll label that axis as distance with the unit of meters. Make sure that you include the units for your axis title. If I click next and then finish, I have a graph. And I can stretch this graph out so that I can see it more easily by just moving my cursor over to the corner, and I can drag this down and over to select the size that I'd like. The first thing I want you to do at this point is to click the series icon, and then on your keyboard press the delete button. And what that does is it gives you more area to display the data for your graph. So let's take a look. We have a graph with my data points plotted, a graph title, as well as axes titles with units. You're in a good position right now. What you need to do, because we plan on printing this out, to make it clearer, I want to get rid of this gray background. To do that, move your cursor into a place that's not on a line or on a data point, and right-click in the background. You have a menu that comes up that says Format Plot Area. Select that. On the right, up top, where it says Area, select the option for None and click OK. And you can see that you've now cleared out the area on the background. Okay, the next thing we need to do is to give our data what is called a trend line. A trend line is something that you add to a graph to give you an idea as to how the data points are behaving. In other words, if they are behaving in a manner that is linear, then you should see a progression that is pretty linear. In other words, that they're pretty much a straight line could go right through all of those data points. Or it could be parabolic, where your data points are getting further and further apart, and it kind of makes a banana-like shape, or what we call a parabola. To enter a trend line, you need to move your cursor on top of one of your data points. It doesn't matter which one. And then right-click. The menu pops up, giving you the option to add a trend line. Select this option. At this point, you have a menu that pops up that can give the option to either have a linear trend line or a polynomial trend line. If the data looks linear, and I'm going to drag this out of the way to actually see, this is where your brain comes in and says, are these data points linear? If you can feel that by looking at them, that you see that one line can pretty much go through all of them, that they show a basic trend line that is linear, then you will leave this option selected for linear. Now, the way that I have it, it looks very linear. That's just because of the values that I've chosen for time are in very regular increments. Every 4 seconds, it goes up for 5 meters. But your data points may look a little bit off from this, but if they look pretty linear, then leave it as a linear trend line. Before you get out of this option menu, you need to go up to the top and select the tab that says Options. At this point, you need to select the option to set your intercept equal to 0 if your data needs to go through the 0 intercept point. And that means over here where it says 0, 0, does it make sense that your data goes through this point? It does for this one. At 0 seconds, I'm 0 meters away. So this graph should go through the 0, 0 intercept point. If it does not need to go through the origin, then do not select this option. The other option you need to select is to display the equation on the chart. By clicking this option, you will have an equation placed on your graph that agrees with the trend line you chose. For example, if you chose a linear trend line, then it will give you an equation of a line that is in the form of y equals mx plus b. If you've chosen the y-intercept to be 0, then your b will be 0, because that is, of course, where the line intersects at the y-axis, and so therefore your equation will not show a value for b. It will only show you y equals mx. For the r-squared value, you can select this option if your instructor asks you to do it. What the r-squared value shows you is how linear your data points are. If the closer it is to 1, then the more linear your values are. Unless your instructor has asked you to select this option, you can leave it blank. Now you can click OK, and you can see that automatically a trend line has been added for your data, along with an equation for your line. In this case, because it is linear, it is of the form y equals mx. Again, with the b equal to 0, so it is not shown. I like to select the equation and move it out of the way so that it's not in the way of my graph, and I'll just place it up top. Okay, you're in a good position here. You're almost done. If your instructor asks you to add grid lines to your plot, and this may be useful for manually determining the slope of a trend line that you've added, you can do it in this way. In the background of the graph, make sure you're not on any lines or any data points or any trend lines. In the background, in a clear section, if you right-click, the option comes up to change your chart options. So click on Chart Options. This is a familiar screen. You saw this before when you were making your graph. But what I want you to do is up top, you'll see a tab called Grid Lines. Click on the Grid Lines tab and add major and minor grid lines for both the x and the y axis. If you click OK, you now have a graph that has grid lines that you can use to manually calculate the slope of your trend line. And that is the end of the tutorial on plotting your data using earlier versions of Microsoft Excel 2000 or Excel 2003.